The sound of clean energy. A swoosh that could soon be sweeping the land. Since 2015, the building of projects like this in South Kyle, East Ayrshire, have been effectively banned in England, when rules introduced by David Cameron meant an objection from just one person over an onshore wind farm could stop it going ahead. That is about to change.
I'm delighted to rise today to bring before the House our landmark energy bill for its consideration. This world-leading historic bill, a Conservative bill, will deliver for this country cleaner, cheaper and more secure energy.
Planning permission for onshore wind farms will be relaxed, and those communities that choose to build them will benefit from cheaper electricity, the government says.
And I want to thank the government for the constructive dialogue.
In doing so, they've also stifled an energy bill rebellion led by former COP President Alok Sharma. But for the few Conservative backbenchers that oppose this bill, there's much to oppose.
I have to say, I absolutely despise this bill. I've been in this House for 8 years, and I've rarely seen a bill of such nature, 426 pages, and it's attracted 146 pages of amendments.
The fear for a government facing an election is how will the prospect of wind farms popping up in England's green and pleasant land go down with voters? Surprisingly well, according to the data. About 3/4 of people say they would back an onshore wind farm in their local area, according to a poll this week by YouGov for the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. Aha, I hear you say, but that's all voters, not Conservative voters in Conservative areas like here in Berkshire, who Conservative MPs care about. Well, 71% of people who voted Conservative at the last election say they would back them too. Onshore wind is an area where there has pretty consistently been a chasm between policymakers and the very people who voted for them. Onshore wind farms, yes or no?
Yes, absolutely.
Not worried about them spoiling the natural beauty?
No, I don't think they do.
Yes, I think we've got to.
Got to?
Yeah.
Even if it spoils the looks of around here?
Are we talking about around here, or?
No. Is it different now?
No, it's necessary. It's got to go electric, isn't it?
I think it's positive. I think green energy is good for the environment rather than burning fossil fuels. But obviously you don't want a wind turbine right next to your house or in your community. So as long as it's in open areas, maybe something like Green and Common or on open farmlands, then yeah, all for it.
Is that a yeah, as long as I don't actually have to look at it?
Somewhat, yeah. No, I'd take it all offshore. Makes more sense.
But what about onshore? Not cheaper?
I think it would create more problems because of the amount of traffic, the amount of construction work.
Ultimately though, final decisions will still be taken by local councillors, and what the government plans does not go far enough, say critics.
The planning regulations place several layers of extra difficulty to installing wind turbines that don't exist for other kinds of developments. And I would say that unless they strip back all of those layers that currently make it almost impossible to build a wind turbine in England, then they're simply not acting according to the public will.
Last year, just 42% of the UK's energy was generated by renewables. By 2050, the UK economy is meant to be net zero, which will need many more of these on our horizons.
Well, earlier I spoke to the former Energy Minister Chris Skidmore and began by asking how much of a difference this government U-turn on onshore wind would actually make.
Well, I think it's an important signal to industry and construction that the government is now changing its mind. For 10 years we had a moratorium in place that has seen barely any onshore wind being produced. Onshore wind is one of the cheapest forms of energy. It will lead to lower energy bills for householders, and we need to see a rapid escalation. We won't be using much land onshore to develop onshore wind, up to like 1 to 3% of all land. So people shouldn't be afraid of actually having additional developments. What this change does is to stop a single person putting in an objection that scuppers a whole renewable community project that could help supply an entire neighbourhood.
What kind of scale, realistically? Because the industry is saying, well, this is kind of tweaks around the edges, it's not going to make a huge difference.
So the onus now, I think, is on making sure that this works and is actually realistically put into practice, because the UK is falling behind other countries. I mean, even Ukraine has managed to build more onshore wind turbines than we have in the past year. There is no excuse for not giving local people, local community groups what they want, which is to build out this fantastic form of energy.
Well, is it what local people want? Because are the incentives going to be sufficient to persuade local groups to back this?
Recent polling has repeatedly shown that at least 60% of the population are supportive of onshore wind. I think there's been a sea change in the past 10 years of actually local support for recognising that this is an important form of energy, and actually government and Westminster have been behind the curve on this.
You talked about the scale of public support for onshore wind. It's not so for every policy, is it? We've just seen the Uxbridge by-election where the Tories successfully weaponised ULEZ, the emissions charge, against Labour to win that seat. So do you fear now that the government could look at that and in many instances, not this one, not onshore wind, but in many instances, take a leaf out of the book of the former Prime Minister David Cameron and say, let's cut the green crap?
Well, I think it's really important to start by saying that ULEZ is not a net zero measure. It's not seeking to cut carbon dioxide emissions at all. It's actually there to reduce nitrous oxide, sulphurous oxide, and that's one of the key aspects around reducing air pollution. And what we need to do is we don't blur the lines here and create some kind of bizarre culture war on net zero, when net zero is very simple. It is about reducing our carbon dioxide emissions, but also putting more money back into people's pockets, because renewable energy is 9 times cheaper than gas. Actually, it's a cost of gas crisis, a cost of fossil fuel crisis that drove up energy prices this year. And actually, if we had renewables in place, if we actually had some of these green measures that David Cameron cut 10 years ago, it would have saved householders £1.5 billion.
Despite your green credentials, you don't back ULEZ emissions charges elsewhere, even though it's a Tory policy.
No, I back ULEZ, and I've been open about that in the past. I think that when it comes to looking at whether policies that are made by mayors and by local authorities, we should trust in devolution in those communities that know what's best for their local area. And there are cities that recognise that their air pollution levels are unacceptably high and are causing unnecessary levels of death.
You put down lots of amendments today, pushing the government to end new oil and gas licences, amongst other things. Your opponents on your own benches put down a whole slew of other amendments boosting oil and gas. Who do you think most has Rishi Sunak's ear? Not on onshore wind, but the whole panoply of green policies.
In 10 years' time, I think the future will be very different. I remember having voted in this place on things like equal marriage, and many MPs then, having voted against that, regretted what they did 10 years later. I think actually when it comes to looking at tackling fossil fuels, tackling the climate crisis, ensuring that we can produce the most affordable forms of energy for people, fossil fuels are becoming more expensive. When it comes to investment, 10 years ago, investment in oil was 6 times that of solar. This year, for the first time, solar has received more investment than oil. The world is changing beneath our feet, and we need to recognise that Westminster and Whitehall are behind the curve. And I don't mind who that is specifically. It's not about personalities, it's about policies, and the policies need to shift to recognise the new economic reality.
Chris Skidmore, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the Shadow Climate Change Secretary, Ed Miliband. I put it to him the government has been pushed into this U-turn on onshore wind. Labour have a far more radical policy if they come to power, with a doubling of onshore wind and a tripling of solar power, for example. But can that be done?
This isn't a U-turn, this is a half-assed compromise, and frankly, the government has bottled it. What they've done before today is had a uniquely restrictive planning regime for onshore wind, so it's harder to build onshore wind, the cheapest form of power we have in this country, but it's harder to build onshore wind than anything else. After today, it remains easier to build an incinerator, easier to build a landfill site than onshore wind, and the industry is saying this isn't going to make really hardly any difference at all.
Right, so you think it may be dozens of new wind turbines rather than hundreds?
Look, I mean, what the industry says is because of all of the hoops that are being erected, they are very doubtful this will make much difference. And the question is why? If it's so cheap, and it is cheaper, 3 times cheaper than fossil fuels, and it is popular, why? And the truth is that we're being held hostage, the government is being held hostage by a small group of conservative backbenchers who, for reasons best known to themselves, think somehow onshore wind is a massive problem.
Right. You are an evangelist on all of this, and I just want to come back to your pledges. If you win power, a doubling of onshore wind, a tripling of solar, a quadrupling of offshore wind. Is that remotely deliverable?
Totally doable. Look, the truth is, Kathy, that before the government introduced, for example, on onshore wind, before they introduced the ban in 2015, the ban introduced by David Cameron in England, we were building enough onshore wind to get us a long, long way forward. But they introduced this ban, and you know, there's a wider lesson here. Why are people watching this program still facing the worst cost of living crisis in memory? Because they're facing the worst energy bills crisis in memory. And why is that? Because we are so dependent on fossil fuels. And the only way out of it, and the thing this government fails to understand, is we've got to drive for renewables. A clean energy sprint, as I call it, zero carbon power by 2030.
Right, so you've said no new oil and gas licences in the North Sea.
Sure.
You said, in fact, just to quote you, that Rishi Sunak's new licences drive a coach and horses through our climate commitments. Yeah. So you'll revoke them, will you?
We're not going to close down the existing oil and gas industry overnight. That would be a ridiculous thing to do. We're not going to turn off the taps. So that's why the right, balanced approach of Labour is to say we let existing fields continue, but we won't issue new licences once we're in government.
You've said that you're on the side of the builders, not the blockers. You're building hundreds of thousands more houses. You're building on the green belt. You're throwing up all these wind farms all over the place. How do you get local support for that? Do you have to do what the government says it will do, which is reduce their bills and incentivise?
Yes. You know, and look, I think it should be absolutely compulsory for any clean energy project, and I include in that onshore wind, and I also include in that things like grid infrastructure, that local people get benefit. I don't just mean the general benefit that we get from clean power, but local people get benefit. Absolutely, and I've seen locally a wind farm near me that there is local benefit for it.
Just finally, you've stayed in your job as part of the shadow cabinet reshuffle.
I'm very pleased I am too.
A lot of Blairites now promoted to the top table. As a Brownite yourself, so you were Gordon Brown's
Kathy,
former special advisor.
Okay,
but are you pleased to see your old foes round the table?
I don't recognise that description at all. Look, we are a Labour shadow cabinet that I was at this morning, focused not on navel-gazing, but focused on the country. And I've known Keir Starmer a long time. And one of the great things of Keir Starmer's many attributes is he is not a factional or sectarian person. He wants to use the talent from across the Labour Party, and that's what he's doing.
And the Blairites are good for winning, aren't they?
I think every part of the Labour Party, and I don't recognise these terms, they are genuinely out of date. Every part of the Labour Party can contribute to our election victory and making this country what it can be.
Are you a Starmerite now, then?
Absolutely.
Ed Miliband, thanks very much.
Thank you.